All right, welcome everybody. I am still thrilled to have all of you here tonight. We never know, you've probably heard me say this before, but we never know what we're going to get when we throw a topic out there. And I was laughing because the trolley and the streetcars are usually pretty popular, but we often morph them or kind of promote them with Wildwood Amusement Park. And so that always draws a crowd. So what I will tell you is most of our programs in the past have been Wildwood Amusement Park heavy and Streetcar light. It's sort of a side topic. This one is more Streetcar company heavy, but we will talk about Wildwood and because of course they are all interchanged, so are interchangeable and twisted together. So you can't do one without the other really. But it is a very interesting topic. And the other piece that I will share is that I had a tough time narrowing this one down to a regular sized program, mainly because we had a grant last year where I was able to spend almost a year going through 59 boxes of corporate records of the Twin City Rapid Transit Company, which may sound horrendous to some of you, but if you know me at all, you know that that's like Christmas, and to get paid for it is even better. So I was able to do that, and I expect that there will be additional programs about various angles of the transit company and its subsidiaries as we go. But this is sort of the general overview of how we got to where we are and what they were doing. So before I go too much further, I should probably introduce myself for those who don't know me. I'm Sarah Hansen, the Executive Director at the White Bear Lake Area Historical Society, and along with our Creative Director, Deanne Jones, who generally helps make all of these slides and things pretty, and records these programs, which is why I wasn't allowed to speak for a hot minute there, and it puts them online for us. If a slide is not pretty, I guarantee it's one I made. So usually takes them to a much different level. In addition, I'd like to thank Ramsey County, the library system, for having us do these presentations, which are typically funded through the Land and Legacy Amendment. And then, of course, our members at the Historical Society, because without the support of our members, we wouldn't be able to do a lot of these programs and projects. So thank you. Thank you for being here. And if you are a current member, thank you. If you are not, there's membership info on the table, and we'd love to have you join. And with that, I will end the commercial. And we'll dive right in. So there are several things that are intertwined when it comes to streetcars and the streetcar system in Minnesota. And Thomas Lowry is one of those things that is pretty much inextricable from that process. Lowry got started early in the streetcar system. He was involved in the Minneapolis Street Railway. And did I lose a slide? They're jumping around on me. We're going to jump to this one really quick because this is going to help you understand what I'm trying to say. So we'll get back to Lowry in just a second, but he is very critical in all of this. In fact, this was his vision, if you will. So if you look at the lines, if you look at the system, tonight we're here to talk about the Twin City Rapid Transit Company, which is really the overarching company, and then its subsidiaries. So what essentially happened is the St. Paul, within the city of St. Paul, they started their own railway and had their own city railway. In Minneapolis, they had their own city railway, and you can see very early, there was actually legislation as early as the 1850s, I believe, that authorized street railways and systems to be able to put the cities to be able to do that. And so those two began, and then St. Paul actually expanded out to the suburbs a little bit. They went beyond their borders, let's put it that way, fairly quickly. And so they kind of grew and continued on. And then pretty quickly from there, Minneapolis tied up with them. So it became the St. Paul, Minneapolis and Suburban Railway, or Minneapolis, St. Paul and Suburban Railway, and had a couple of configurations of that. Ultimately, the Twin City Rapid Transit Company came to own that and all of what made that. So as I went through all of those corporate records, I was able to go through records from each of those companies and try to figure out how they were all coming together. What was intriguing fairly quickly was the fact that it was extremely clear that as you look at some of these companies down below, they're all different companies, and they came around close to the same time, within a decade or so. Almost all of them had the same officers, same investors, same folks involved. And so they were essentially organized. It got a little wonky for a bit there and to try to sort it all out. But they were essentially organized for a couple of reasons. And it took a while to make it clear. So a transit company is ruled by a lot of very specific regulations. They are a public trust sort of thing. They're a public entity, or they're a private company, but they are given a franchise, much like the cable company or something like that, and to provide a public service. And so they, as time went on, they could not do a lot of other things. So for example, they got into they formed the transit supply company to sort of act as a clearinghouse for different things that the individual transit companies needed. They got into the real estate company because there were areas where they needed to buy and sell land, purchase property, and have additional depots or train stations or car barns where you weren't running a train, but you needed to store it or fix it. And then you get into the Minnetonka and White Bear Navigation Company, which we'll get in a little deeper on it in a few minutes, but interestingly, was essentially for the steamboats that went on the lakes and the amusement parks and all of those things that had nothing at all to do with transit, really. I mean, I guess the boats did, but different type of thing. And then, of course, as time went on, the buses came into play, and we'll talk about those as well. Let's see here. There we go. So some folks ask, how on earth did they have, railways or street railways in the 1870s, 1880s? That's how. Of course, they didn't have engines or electricity running them at that point. They had horse-drawn cars. That is actually a Minneapolis streetcar, as you can see labeled on it. It was this photo is from sometime in the 1880s. Sorry, the 1880s. You can see not very well, but you can probably tell that the streets are mud. They're not. There's nothing lovely. In fact, I was reading a couple of stories today about the system in Minneapolis and how frustrated folks got early on because they tried to do some sort of wooden track to have the wheels actually stay on the rails. Well, all they did was lay 2x4s on the ground, and the cars kept hopping off, and then the whole idea. This man was complaining because the whole idea was to get the business people into work and from their houses and into the city. Well, and not have to walk in the mud and do all the things. And he said, well, the cars kept going off the boards, off the rails, and they'd have to get out and lift them back on in the mud. So it didn't work very well, as you can imagine. But you never know. All right. So if you had any doubt, I don't know. Lowry's, I'm going to pop back to Lowry back here, and for some reason they're coming up in a strange order in that regard. But so Thomas Lowry, the name's probably familiar if you've been around the Twin Cities at all. We have Lowry Park, Lowry Tunnel, other areas. Those are because of Thomas Lowry, whose vision, he was involved with the Minneapolis Street Railway System, and that it was really his vision that created that whole larger picture and trying to pull everything together. This was not necessarily an altruistic vision in the sense that he owned a lot of property around the metro, what we would think of today as the metro area, and he wanted to provide people safe transportation to get there, easy transportation to get there, and so he certainly came up with that concept of adding the lines all over. He was spot on in many ways, and one of his big things was pushing the amusement parks. So at the end of each set of, in the far east and the far west, he wanted to put an amusement park so that not just commuters during the day would take the trains or the streetcars into the city and back home at night. It would be also those who were wanting to go out in the evening and go to the amusement park, or those who wanted to go on the weekends. And so getting folks in and out and moving around in that way too. One of the things, I had to chuckle at this one, because one of the things that he did not hit the mark on. This was after an announcement when the TCRT was first organized, interestingly, first organized under the laws of the state of New Jersey, by the way, but with some Minnesota investors and some out east. But as he says, our object is to control the stock of the two companies in St. Paul and Minneapolis. The companies necessarily in the two cities have one and the same interests, as have all other enterprises in St. Paul and Minneapolis. The time is rapidly approaching when the consolidation of the two cities will not only be expected, but desired for the interest of both. We're still waiting. I think he missed that one. He was pretty savvy on a lot of things, but that would be pretty impressive. I will give him the fact that that was only about 12 years after Minneapolis and St. Anthony had merged from two separate cities into one. So, it wasn't unheard of, but I don't think that's going to happen here. So as I was saying, if you had any doubt about Lowry and his impact on the system, his sort of being the face of it, I had to laugh when I saw this headline that just said, "The marvelous transformation in the Lowry system," period. I mean, that is how it was known. He was the driver for sure. Interestingly, he passed away in 1909, and his brother-in-law, Calvin Goodrich, who you see here, took over. He had been vice president in most of the enterprises, most of the different pieces as they had been organized, but he was the one to step in when Lowry passed away. Lowry was married to Goodrich's sister Beatrice, and when Goodrich passed away in 1915, Thomas and Beatrice's son Horace stepped in and sort of took the reins. So it was absolutely a family business, family enterprise, if you will, something that they were passionate about as time went on. So let's bring it out to this area a little bit. And we will get to lots of maps in a moment. So actually fairly quickly. So they started out by wanting to do, they had the Minneapolis and the St. Paul. But again, almost from the beginning, it was a vision to spread out into the suburbs and into Hopkins and St. Louis Park and into out to North St. Paul and South St. Paul to the south, and Stillwater and South Stillwater very specifically, which they went through a lot of work to do that. So here you see that they're talking about, this is 1899, and their goal was to get from Wildwood, which they already had tracks to, so they came up from St. Paul through North St. Paul and hit the bottom of the lake, the south end of the lake, if you will, at Matamidi, and they wanted to add out to Stillwater. And so it was impressive because they announced that in March and started work pretty quickly. They were first expected to be open in July of 1899. They didn't quite make July, but they did hit August. I thought it was entertaining that this is May, and as you can read, it says, they began running regular cars to Wildwood, marking the season's opening. The exodus of pleasure seekers was not large. They were not happy, but that's, it was the beginning of May. You never know what it's like around here. But they thought the final line, good attractions will soon be offered there, was sort of an omen of things to come. Because in the next 5 years or so, and far beyond, but in the next 5 years or so, they started investing heavily in the park itself and trying to bring all sorts of things. This is a piece of letterhead, or part of a piece of letterhead for Jacob Barnett, who was a manager of Wildwood. This is actually 1898, so he was manager in 1897, 1898 seasons. But you can see what he already had, what they had there, bathing, swimming, the boating and dancing, roller coasting, bowling alley, water toboggan slide, ball grounds, first-class restaurant, free swings, free picnic grounds, and of course refreshments. So they had, there was something happening there. There had been a park and attractions since the beginning of the 1890s, roughly. And so they were planning to build on that. There were lots of fits and starts in different places. They also were reporting then in May of 1899 that the Council of White Bear, so the Village Council, considers the street railway proposal. On the right, what you see are the actual minutes from that meeting at the Village Council on May 18th, 1899. And they authorized an ordinance that, they thought this was interesting, Thomas Lowry and C.G. Goodrich, authorizing them to build and operate a street railway line in the village of White Bear. Not the Twin City Rapid Transit, not a specific company, but those two individuals, which is kind of an interesting way to go about it, I guess. Now, that caused a ruckus, if you can imagine. The railroad, which had been very loyal to White Bear, had invested heavily in White Bear, so the actual trains, the steam railroad, was not happy of the idea that a streetcar company was going to come into the village. And so immediately, they jumped back and said, wait a minute, you can see in the middle there, the first hostile move was made by the Duluth, which was the railroad company, yesterday in announcing a round-trip rate of 25 cents to all points on White Bear Lake and Bald Eagle to take effect today and continue until further notice. With the exception of Wildwood, the Duluth has long enjoyed a monopoly of White Bear business, and the action of the road yesterday is to protect that business from electric line competition. So not everyone was happy. I will say that, interestingly, a little bit, well, it's actually not too bad up on the big screen. So this is the Twin Cities in general. You can see this is today Little Canada down here. So kind of the northeast side of the Twin Cities, St. Paul. Of course, we are up there. The red lines are streetcar lines as they make their way around. The darker lines, the black that goes up and around the top of the lake, that is railroad line. And it actually comes down here and continues, of course, into St. Paul. So even without the streetcar coming from Wildwood at the bottom there and around the south and west side of the lake into the village, we had access to St. Paul and Minneapolis fairly easily. We had regular trains and all sorts of things. The route that goes up the east side in Matamidi Delwood really is what didn't have a lot of access from the streetcar, but they definitely had trains also that came around over the north of the lake and out towards Stillwater. Franchise and the public utility, if you will, or public entity, public service, they had to apply and attempt to get into the city or into the village and get permission. They also had to do the same thing when they were pulling the service and the system out. And if you can imagine, because change is hard, we all know this, in 1904, when they were trying to come into the village, people said, you can't do that. They go faster than our horses. They'll be speeding down the streets or down the tracks. They'll be blocking the intersections. They'll be doing all these horrible things. People are going to die. We can't do that. And of course, they did it. And people, I'm sure there were people who died, not necessarily in White Bear, but there were accidents, there were things. I'm not trying to minimize that at all. But I'm just saying that, they did it. People were fine. It worked. It come 1932, and as you can imagine, the stock market had crashed. The economy was not pretty. People were not they certainly weren't riding for pleasure like they had been. They were not necessarily riding for work because a lot of them were out of work, so they weren't commuting back and forth. And because of all of those elements of it, the Railroad and Warehouse Commission, who was the oversight or the organization who was able to see had to authorize the fares, for example, for the different rides on the streetcar. So they couldn't pick their ticket prices. They had to go with what the Railroad and Warehouse Commission said. And so they didn't want to raise rates, as you can imagine, because people were having difficulties. Well, the system had been in place for 30 years at that point, 40 years for some parts, older for others, and they were constantly upgrading and reinvesting. But that needs to continue, and of course, as you can imagine, it wasn't going very well. So what they did was decided to pull back and pull out lines like the extension to Stillwater and down to South Stillwater, the extension around White Bear and a few others in the suburban areas. And when they announced that, or went to get permission to do that, people went crazy and said, you can't do that. That's our lifeline to the city. You can't take away our rails. You can't take away our streetcars. We need them. But they ended up getting permission to do so anyway. And so what I find interesting is like I said, as we understand it, this is one of the last cars that went through White Bear. And this, of course, it's just right out here at the corner. That's the Domino's building today at 2nd and Clark out there, but was the fire station and the city hall and all of that at that time. The streetcar was coming through, and I find it very interesting that the automobile is sitting next to it. It's very symbolic that, it's kind of the sign of the times, I guess. But like I say, they did pull out the tracks and did change kind of the way things went. The cars continued on into Mahtomedi into the 1950s, but this didn't blow up as well as I had hoped. But the gist of it is interesting. It's an 1892 article, and I wanted to just talk for a moment about the impact of the employment elements of the streetcar system, the jobs that were created through the system and through the company. The beginning of this talks about, says an army of men is supported by the Minneapolis Street Railway Company, and there are several thousands fed by the wages earned by the employees of the company. And it goes on and on. Then it says, during the past summer, there were employed in the construction department of the company an average of 700 men. Now that would have been as they were building more track, building more things and expanding. And this is 1892. So as we know, that expansion went on for at least another decade, more than a decade beyond that. So there was constant growth there. But then if you go down to the bottom where it's highlighted in green, the conductors and motormen are in the majority, of course, but then there are a large number of clerks, engineers, firemen, and repairers. The number of men continually on the payroll of the company is about 1,000. So significant. At that point, in the 1890 census, the population of Minneapolis and St. Paul was about 300,000. So not a gigantic number, but not an insignificant number from an employment standpoint. And then, of course, the stories we really like to get into are the motorettes. This is Helen Murphy. She was a local lady out here who was a motorette in the 1940s because most of the men who had been motormen were off at war. And so they needed to bring in folks from who could do the work. And so at the peak of women operators in service, July 1945, they had 115 permanent motorettes with the company. And their first conductorette, which the conductors were a little bit different than the motor, they essentially checked the tickets and did the things in the train car or the streetcar. The motormen or motorettes were doing the actual motoring, the driving. But the first conductorette was hired in April of 1945. Interestingly, they hired 381 motorettes for the company in the 1940s during the war. 305 completed training. So not everyone made it all the way through their training, but 305 did. And then they hired 126 conductorettes. Of those, 109 completed their training. So they ended up with well over 400 people, 400 women working. During the war, the height of the war, in 1943, there were 83 women hired. 1944, 271, and 1945, they had hired 153. So, and then by the time of July of 1945, they had 115 of them still working as permanent employees. So I actually had the pleasure of meeting Helen Murphy, and some of you may have as well. We did out of nowhere, we did an event probably 20 years ago, and the streetcars were the theme of the program. We did a fall annual meeting dinner kind of thing over at the Lakeside Club, which is also no longer in Mahtomedi, but over at the Lakeside Club, and her grandson brought her, and she still had her uniform and her hat and the whole thing, and she was so proud of being a motorette. She's passed away now, but she was so happy to have been part of that piece of our history. So Now, like I said, the 30s were tough, of course, with the economy and all of the pieces going. The park was not as profitable as it once had been. And of course, the idea behind the park, for those who may not have been aware, the idea behind the park was that if you rode the streetcar, they wanted your money on the streetcar fares. You rode the streetcar to get there, you could get into the park for free. They tagged you for just about everything else, from your swimsuits if you wanted to rent one to every ride you took. But you could get into the park and swim or whatever for free. So it didn't necessarily have to bring in a lot of money, in the sense of it was sort of subsidized by the rail lines. I'm sure they did bring in a ton of money from some of the rides and things when times were good. By 1938, times weren't so good. They had really downsized throughout the 30s. When they pulled up the tracks to White Bear and Stillwater in 1932, they had started to downsize, and they had really outsourced the management of the park. They had different, had it been sort of under their umbrella more heavily up to that point. As time went on, they just sort of subbed it out and said, okay, if you want to do it, you deal with it, you figure it out. Through the 30s. And so it really became a dance hall sort of situation and music more than anything. But by April of 1938, they had decided they were done, and they wanted to abandon the park, take out all of the buildings and things. And but they were very clear that the streetcar lines would continue, or the streetcars would continue from North St. Paul out through Matamidi over the Wildwood line. They were just taking out the other. And every scan from the newspapers that are out there from this particular ad are terrible. I don't know why, but it is interesting. This is them actually later that summer selling complete stock of lumber, new and used. They were selling off the doors, the sashes, the shingles, the plumbing, insulation, anything they could from the park to be repurposed. So people would go out and pick up staircases, wooden stairs and other things. One of the other questions we get all the time is, what happened to the park property? How did that get divided out? And so what you see here, it's again a little bit different than how we kind of typically look at it, but you see this is Birchwood Road making its way around from Birchwood, and it hits, today it's Old Wildwood Beach Road, but then 244 comes through as well down this way, and then continues on around that way. All of these pieces, you can see the part right on the shore was owned by the Minnetonka and White Bear Navigation Company. As I said, they were the ones who were tasked with the amusement parks, the boats, all of the pieces of that. Interestingly, the adjacent area is owned by the Rapid Transit Real Estate Corporation, so one of the holding companies, or one of the companies that they had, and then this side as well. One of the things we hear a lot, and I will never say never, but I have yet to see anything that truly supports it, is that Willerny, the neighborhood in Willerny, was designed for for housing for the people who worked at the park. Well, the park certainly didn't have anything to do with it. I mean, this is Willerny over here. They didn't own it at this point. At the end, there was a small period where they may have owned it, but by the time it was platted in 1914 and developed, it was not owned by the park. It was actually sold to a few people, but one of the names, and this is one of those things I want to play with and track down a little better, but one of the names is Dwinell. And Dwinell is a name, there's actually a Dwinell Street or road, I'm not sure which it is, up near the Delwood border, Delwood-Matamidi border. He developed property up that way. And so there's nothing that I can come across that tells me that gives any sort of weight to that particular story. The other thing that makes me think no, and you can actually see this map has Willerny on there, so you can actually see where it is in conjunction with the rest of it, but the pieces that were the park or owned by the transit company were from this line over. They were, I've gone through the census records trying to find any reference to anyone local staying at, living in that vicinity and working at the park, and there's like 2 or 3 total through the decades. So it's not, certainly not jumping up as automatic, but this is a favorite map for folks because it shows how the properties, the lots were platted out after the park was dismantled. So it shows where the things were, the roller coaster and the pavilion and all of that, but then the very specific names of the families who purchased the different lots as time went on. So as they developed those, and most, well, I won't say most, but most of the, well, I think most of the houses that were built immediately after in the early 50s are gone at this point, but they've been redone. I'll just do a quick, this is the last streetcar at the Matamidi stop, and you can see the little sort of phone booth kind of hut there and the Matamidi sign up above it. But you can see how they changed over the years a bit, and lots of advertising, lots of other forms of revenue that they were trying to pull in. And then, of course, this is 1948 as the time goes on, and we see the buses come in. And buses were always part of it. They supplemented the streetcar routes because, of course, there weren't rails everywhere. And so they always had buses coming and going. But you can see here the solid lines are streetcar lines. The dashed lines are bus lines. This is 1948. And so you can see still coming up from St. Paul through North St. Paul, up the Matamidi side was the streetcar. At this point, the left side, the west side of the lake, which of course is the White Bear, downtown White Bear and Bald Eagle areas, is now being serviced by buses on that end going into St. Paul. Not so much buses like we think of. It always makes me laugh a little bit to see these. It reminds me, I equate them to the fire trucks that, you know, again, if you look at the dominoes across the street when you're leaving tonight, the fire trucks could fit in those front windows as their garage doors. Clearly our fire trucks today could not. Same thing, our buses today could not, but this bus could fit something like that at that time. You can see it's branded as the Twin City Motor Bus Company. And this is where I always sort of chuckle. So this building, which you I'm sure recognize from downtown White Bear, this is Banning and 3rd. This was the bus garage for the Twin City Motor Bus Company, the TCRT bus company. You can see where the main doors are for the building on both sides were the garage doors for the buses. So we often refer to this particular strip of 3rd Street, you can see a little bit up there, as the transportation sort of hub in town, because this was the bus garage on the corner. And then down the block a little ways was the taxi stand. It happened to be the Ribel family's home, but they ran the taxis. And so there were taxis always waiting out front and ready to go. So, and we'll end with this image because you led right into it before, but a little bit, but not quite. But I just want to say that, well, there isn't a lot of the streetcar, evidence of the streetcar system today. If you look, there are different paths and different things if you follow the maps, and Scott's done a wonderful job of doing that on the south side of the lake, for example, and you'll see different things. But Matamidi has done a fabulous job of honoring that history and that past and putting Streetcar Park in there. They're actually working to create some sort of a structure. They've done one, and I think they're working to build another that sort of imitate is not quite the right, replicates or lets you see what the structures in the streetcar at the streetcar depot or the streetcar stations would have looked like, for people to have a better sense of that as they go. But that is one of their park spots in Matamidi now. So that's the official end of my spiel, if you will. But if you have questions, I'm happy to try to answer them, or sometimes others can answer as well. Here, Ellen.